Most people have never heard the word. If they have heard it, or if they somehow ran across it in their reading, they probably ignored it because it didn't seem to make any sense. The word is limerence, Limerence. It was coined back in the 1970s by Dr. Dorothy Tennov when she did a study of people that identified themselves as being madly in love. In her qualitative study, in other words, she was not testing people, she just did a lot of interviews, and then she looked for the commonalities among those people who said that they were madly in love. And so she coined this word, limerence, to identify people in that state, and then wrote a book about it. Unfortunately, many people in the 1970s who were psychologists or marriage counselors or therapists did not accept her conclusions, thinking, no, you're making something out of nothing. It doesn't really exist like that. Interestingly, even today, and I'm recording this in the month of February in 2017, even today, I'm occasionally invited to come to some group of counselors or therapists somewhere who work with marriages, particularly marriages in trouble, and I'll teach them about limerence, and most of them, at least in the experiences that I've had, most of them had never heard of it. And once I explain it to them in detail, the light bulbs go off. Oh, that explains this, and that explains that. Yes. I want to explain it to you, if I may. Going beyond what Tennov found back in the 1970s, oh, and by the way, the research then since 1970s has been outstanding. Dr. Helen Fisher and her colleagues have done it a different way than Tennov did. She is an anthropological biologist, Fisher is, and so they do things such as putting a person who identifies himself or herself as being madly in love into an fMRI. An MRI, of course, takes a picture, but an fMRI is a series of pictures. And they take pictures of the person's brain, and they show them photos of random people, get a picture of the brain, and ever so often they show them a photo of the person that they're madly in love with. Now, in the sciences, we refer to that person as the limerent object. Sometimes just in shorthand, we refer to him or her as the LO. And by doing that and seeing the changes in what fires in the brain, what's taking place there, we identify that it's definitely real. It actually does exist. And Fisher's work has gone on then to examine the behavior of people who are in that state called limerence, and so she's added a great deal to what a great deal to what Tennov wrote in her book back in the 1970s. Interestingly, sometimes when I scan the internet looking for what people know about limerence out there, I see that people who really have no expertise in it at all, other than the fact that maybe at some point they lived through it. And by the way, that does give you some true insight. There's no doubt about that. But no real study on it, not really understanding what's going on in the brain and what's happening to the person. Otherwise, they still quote Tennov quite a bit, even on some things that we now know that Tennov was not exactly right about. That Fisher has found more convincing evidence. And so not everybody who talks about limerence, of the few that do, not everybody who talks about limerence even understands completely what they're talking about. Now, we work with marriages. We work a lot with marriages in crisis. By the way, I'm Dr. Joe Beam. I work for a nonprofit called Marriage Helper. That's Marriage Help ER, Marriage Helper. You can check out our website at Marriage Helper, Marriage Help ER, marriagehelper.com, and you can read a great deal there about this thing called limerence. But in this program, I want to kind of tie it up in a little bit of a bow, if I can, so that we can get a lot of information in one place. And you can listen to this and go, oh, okay, I see how the whole thing fits together. I see how the various pieces of the puzzle come into this thing right there. And that's what I hope to accomplish for you in the next several minutes. So when we talk about limerence, we're talking about people who are madly in love. And my experience comes from reading a lot of research, without a doubt. It also comes from the fact that hundreds of thousands of people have been through workshops and seminars and courses that I have developed. A great number of those people have been through courses that we do for marriages that are in crisis. For example, we do an intensive 3-day workshop for marriages in great crisis. We call it Marriage Helper 911. And in that intense 3 days over the years, and I first began to do that back in 1999, in the years that we have done that, we found that 2/3, actually 67%, 2/3 of the couples that come through that workshop, their marriage has been affected by infidelity, an extramarital affair. Now, for some, it's an affair that was just primarily about sex, or a situation, wrong place, wrong time, did the wrong thing, but the vast majority of them were limerent affairs. What I mean by that is they're married to one person and they wind up being involved with another person. Sometimes are referred to as emotional affairs because they do not always become sexual. Most of the time they do, but not always. And if a person does enter into a limerent affair, and if you prefer, we can call it a relationship affair, it's not really about the sex. It's about the connection between two people. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, if you're married to one, why in the world would you develop limerence with another? I'm going to explain that as best I can. And let's start doing that now. Is limerence a bad thing always? The answer to that is no, it's not. You see, if you have two single people, and one's not going to be really bad for the other one, and they develop limerence for each other, it will lead them to become emotionally involved with each other to the point where they feel they're madly in love, and they want to marry each other, and it can lead a couple to marriage without a doubt. By the way, if that did not happen in your marriage, and if you're a married person, don't panic. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't always occur. The process of falling in love does not necessarily involve going through limerence, although for many people it does. The thing is, though, and I'll explain a lot more about this later, limerence always ends. Now, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but let me back up. You may have noticed I said if two people are single and one is not bad for the other. What I mean by that is if a person who is single and has a right to marry anybody, obviously, winds up in limerence with a person who is just bad news, he or she typically is not going to see that. Sometimes I illustrate, what kind of a silly little illustration in a way. What if you had a 15-year-old girl who brings home a 42-year-old biker who's just recently out of prison, fresh scars on his face from the knife fight he's been in, and by the way, that's not anything against bikers. Just trying to make an illustration here. And she says, Mom, Dad, I've met this man. He's wonderful. I realize he's just out of prison for having killed somebody, but he served his time, and he's really a good guy now, and everything's going to be fine. If she is in limerence with him, she won't pay any attention to that age difference. If she's truly in limerence, she's not going to worry about the fact that he's been in prison or even the fact that he murdered somebody. And I'll explain more about why that happens that way later. In that case, even though they might both be single, limerence can still be a bad thing because it's going to blind her to any negatives about him at all. So limerence is okay for two single people, actually can be a good thing, if one is not terribly bad for the other because that one won't see it. Now, and there's another downside to it. If two people are madly in limerence with each other, I mean, it's really deep, their productivity seems to go away. I once had a young lady that worked for me that I finally had to dismiss because she was in limerence deeply, and she was single, he was single, they were engaged, they were going to get married, but she didn't do any work at all. She spent nearly all day on her computer going to various wedding sites and bridal sites. When we discovered that, we had to let her go. Her productivity just was not what we were paying for. But I'm sure they wound up having a marriage, and I didn't keep up with her. And it's okay then for two single people, other than it's going to stop productivity, or at least dramatically reduce it, and other than one of them being bad for the other. Most often, though, when we talk about limerence, it's in the context of someone who is married to one person and in limerence with another. Typically, that does not happen rapidly. Now, the kind of affairs that I mentioned earlier, like one that's all about sex. So you have a husband, maybe, who is going out and sleeping with prostitutes. That's not about limerence. That's something else altogether and not part of what we'll discuss in this program. But in this relationship affair, in this limerent affair, it typically does not stop off with any intention of violating any boundaries in the current marriage. Now, let me stop here and say a couple of things about that. Sometimes people say, well, what makes a person vulnerable to limerence? I could facetiously say, well, the fact that they're still breathing, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Typically, it's a person who, for whatever reason, feels that he or she is missing something in a relationship. Now, Stay with me because I'm not trying to blame the other spouse at all. I want you to hear me very carefully on this. Often it comes out of childhood. It can come out of previous relationships. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, let's say a person went through childhood and felt unloved, either by mom or dad or both. Maybe there was a divorce and all kinds of horrendous things happened after that. And so this person grew up with this intense need to feel loved and needs it more than other people do, in the sense of, I need to know right now that I'm loved no matter what. That situation, either coming out of childhood or from earlier relationships in life, can put a predisposition to the possibility of limerence, and typically the person isn't aware of it. What I mean by that is they don't actually go through life thinking, I'm going to keep going from one relationship to the next until I find somebody who loves me magnificently. As a matter of fact, most people that we deal with, the vast majority of the people we deal with, never go through limerence with a lot of people. They go through it with one person and maybe two. Now, let me explain. The first time may have been the limerence that led them to get married, if they went through limerence in that situation at all. Many couples don't. The second one, and what I'm describing here, would occur when a married person, it could be the husband, it could be the wife, when the married person develops a relationship with someone else that with time develops into limerence. And when I say with time, it can happen relatively quickly, but usually doesn't. Now, it can, but not always. And this is a person who has some kind of a vulnerability, some kind of susceptibility to needing more affirmation, to needing more sensation of feeling loved, a need to feel that I'm not being ignored, that I really exist, that I have value, that I have substance. That, at least based on the couples that we've worked with, seems to be one of the characteristics that makes a person vulnerable to limerence. Now, interestingly, you as the person's spouse may not even know that that exists. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. For example, if your husband feels this tremendous pain still, when he talks about what happened when he was 12 years old and his dad left his mom for some other woman, and how he felt that dad didn't love me, or that dad loved her more than me because that's why he left mom. Or it's a little girl thinking, boy, I grew up with parents that fought all the time and I avoided them because it seemed, I remember this one time, for example, when I said this one thing and it started a fight between the two of them, and I began to think, am I the reason they hate each other? Am I the reason they create all this misery in our household? It can be all kinds of situations, you understand. It can come out of childhood or early relationships where a person thinks and feels, I'm not sure if I'm really truly lovable as I am. Now, some days they feel they are. Perhaps no days they feel they are. But here's a person with this great need. And as I said a minute ago, sometimes you will know because they've told you about those situations, even though they may not understand the vulnerability that creates in them. And sometimes they don't talk about it at all because the pain is not quite as visible. As terrible as it is to have a physical scar, if we see a physical scar, we know that there's pain behind it and a story. Sometimes seeing the emotional, mental, or spiritual scars is impossible. Because for whatever reason, the person either doesn't recognize them himself or herself because they don't want to think about it, or they have it in their heart, but they keep it hidden because they think it somehow makes them unlovable even more so. And so you might be married to a person where you don't even know that that exists, and years can go by, and you might be thinking, wow, my husband is very successful in his business, and he's got so much confidence, that certainly couldn't be applicable to him. Or my wife is one of the greatest women I know, very involved at church and the PTA at school, loves her children, busy all the time helping other people. This couldn't possibly be her, and I hope it isn't. But sometimes that great success at business, or that being super involved in the lives of other people, or whatever other thing you're looking at, is covering up pain. And can often be, this is what I'm doing so that I can feel like that people need me. So I can feel like I am worthy of respect, admiration, that I truly am lovable. These people, and again, you may have heard me say earlier, that I could facetiously say, well, if you're breathing, you're susceptible.